You can turn, well, I'm waiting for Marcy to take her seat, and then I'm ready to start. As soon as hey, John Harrison. How are you? You so skinny. What you do? You skinny. What you doing?
Let the record show I got 3.
Hey, sweetie. How are you?
Fuel for the marathon. Jamie sitting by Courtney to watch her.
Now, the mics are going to be hot, you all.
Oh, are they?
The mics are going to be hot, so.
Well, you should have told me that before. That's the worst thing that could ever happen to me, Marcia. You know that.
That's why I wore it.
This is not good.
Where's Marcy?
Mics, hot mics.
Where is Marcy and Terry? Oh, here she comes. Here she comes. She's talking to Claire. Come on, Marcy.
Hey, what's going on?
Rosacco.
Musaka?
Rosacco.
Rosacco?
Rosacco. Rosacco.
And she's the president of
She's the vice president.
Vice President VP. Cuyahoga?
Cuyahoga. Just phonetically like it's spelled.
Cuyahoga Community
Cuyahoga.
College, right?
Yep. Come on up, Marcy. I'm waiting on. You can please take your seat so we can begin. The Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will come to order. I'd like to thank the ranking member, my friend Mr. Davis, members of the subcommittee, and my colleagues from the House who are with us today, as well as our witnesses and those in the audience for being here today. I thank you. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and that any written statements be made a part of the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee, Ms. Sewell, Ms. Capter, Mr. Gonzalez, and Mr. Joyce be allowed to sit on the dais with us today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good morning. I want to welcome my colleagues to Cleveland and thank them for coming to the 11th Congressional District of Ohio. I am proud to host this hearing. We are here to examine the state of voting rights and election administration in Ohio. As this subcommittee continues traveling the country, I can think of no better place for our next stop than right here in my home state of Ohio. America prides herself on being a beacon of democracy, but the field hearings we have conducted thus far have shown us a simple truth. America has a long way to go. The right to vote is sacred, yet over the last decade or more, Ohio has transformed from a state that expanded access to the ballot to one that is drastically constricting voters' access. In 2004, Ohio voters faced such long lines at polling locations, some lasting into the next morning, that one court found it left voters, and this is their word, effectively disenfranchised. In response, Ohio adopted what would become known as Golden Week, 35 days of in-person voting, early voting that created 5 days in which voters could register and vote at the same time. Our progress did not last long. In 2014, the state eliminated Golden Week, claiming the change would combat voter fraud despite no evidence of widespread fraud. Counties across the state are allowed only one early voting location, regardless of the population. That means there is one polling place for more than 1 million people in our most populous counties, the same as for our smallest counties. In 2014, the former Secretary of State eliminated Sunday early voting, except the Sunday before Election Day, and evening voting after 5 p.m. Sunday voting days were particularly important for African American parishioners and souls to the polls. Get out the vote efforts on Sundays. Ohio has also implemented voter purging. A 2018 Ohio Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights memorandum stated Ohio is one of the most aggressive states in purging voter registrations. The list of constant changes to our voting laws goes on. These constant changes create confusion for voters. Advocates and litigators have been suing Ohio for years over our discriminatory voting laws. Today, we will hear from people on the front lines of ensuring every Ohioan has the unfettered right to vote. Their testimony will help as the Congress examines what must be done to ensure every eligible voter can exercise his or her constitutional right to vote and can exercise that right in any chosen election, and that the vote will be counted as cast. I would now turn to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Davis of Illinois, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for reminding me these mics be hot. These mics might be hot all day. I want to ask the crowd to give a round of applause to Chairwoman Fudge for bringing this hearing to Cleveland, Ohio today. In my 6.5 years in Congress, I've made a lot of friends, and I can tell you one of the closest friends that I've had, that I've been able to make is Ms. Fudge. And to be here in her hometown, it's a privilege for me also, and I look forward to hearing the witness's testimony. I'm proud also to be joined by some of my Republican and Democratic colleagues. I want to welcome on our side of the dais the first guy I ever met when I got elected to Congress was my good friend and one of my best friends in the world, David Joyce.
And he's been downhill ever since.
David and I met the first day of orientation. We've been best buddies since. As a matter of fact, it's my 4th visit to Cleveland in the last 3 years. And I want to welcome him. Dave's a leader on our Appropriations Committee and does a great job in making sure we get good legislation passed in Washington. And I'd also like to welcome one of our newest colleagues, Anthony Gonzalez. While I miss his predecessor, Jim Renacci, more so because I like to beat him in fantasy football each year, we're very glad to have a new addition to our Republican congressional baseball team in Mr. Gonzalez. As many of you know, he used to catch touchdowns from Peyton Manning. I certainly expect him to catch fly balls from Cedric Richmond this June. Madam Chair, I want to say again thank you for being here. And as the ranking member of the House Administration Committee, our committee has an extremely important task to conduct oversight of federal elections. Throughout the committee's existence, Republicans and Democrats have worked across the aisle to create significant election policy that widely impacted this nation, including legislation to eliminate the poll tax, legislation to create easier access to members of the military and their families when voting overseas, and the Help America Vote Act of 2002, a landmark piece of legislation that took substantial steps to remedy problems seen in the 2000 presidential election. The Subcommittee on Elections was created for the primary purpose to be an extension of the House Administration Committee and enhance our committee's oversight capabilities of federal elections and how these elections are administered. Chairwoman Fudge has been leading our subcommittee with the intention to investigate voting rights issues in order to create a new formula that will reauthorize Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, enacted in 1965 for the purpose of removing racial-based restrictions on voting, has historically been a bipartisan effort. This legislation was most recently authorized under a Republican president and a Republican Congress. In 2013, the Supreme Court determined Section 4 of the VRA to be unconstitutional in Shelby County v. Holder. Chief Justice Roberts said The Voting Rights Act of 1965 employed extraordinary measures to address an extraordinary problem. While the court did not weigh in on whether there is still an extraordinary problem, the Supreme Court did hold that what made sense at one time has lost its relevance. They noted that nearly 50 years later, things changed dramatically. The VRA primarily remains under the jurisdiction of the House Judiciary Committee, and the House Administration Committee, however, has an obligation to review how elections are administered and recognize if any issues should elevate from state to federal level, which is why we are all here today. To that end, a particular issue that has brought us here today is a Supreme Court ruling in the Husted case. At the center of this case is the practice of states performing list maintenance of voter registration rolls. Ultimately, the court ruled that Ohio's practice was a constitutional method of compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. Despite efforts to characterize this practice as voter purging, we must weigh the benefits to voter list maintenance that serves an important role in keeping down election costs, minimizing any existing voter confusion, and reducing long lines at polling locations. As I've said many times since coming into my role as the ranking member of this committee, the greatest threat to our system is partisanship. If there is clear evidence of intentional widespread voter discrimination, Congress should take steps to remedy that in a bipartisan manner. We should do our due diligence to review the facts and the numbers carefully, as well as hear from all stakeholders. What are the voting registration trends? What are the voter turnout trends? It's essential that Congress make well-informed decisions and understand our role in assisting states and not overpowering them. Voting is a fundamental right for every American citizen, and protecting that right is a responsibility that I and my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle take very seriously. Today, I'm here to listen. We are here to learn more from our witnesses about voting rights and election administration. I look forward to hearing from both panels, and I'm very honored that you've agreed to share your testimony with all of us this morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I am going to take one quick point of personal privilege since I'm at home and since I have the mic. I have a number of my family members that are here, including my mother. If you would all stand, please, all of my family.
Yay. Can I say something too?
Yes.
Hey, I know my mic's not hot, but her mother came here today after a dental visit. It is not supposed to be out, so don't ask her to talk much today. But, you know, my mom died 20 years ago today, and she would have been very proud to attend a hearing in my hometown. But to have you here, it's an honor for every one of us sitting at this dais. Thank you very, very much.
That's right. Now, we would have opening remarks from the members of the Committee on House Administration. We would begin with Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Fudge, for your friendship. Thank you very much for bringing this field hearing to the people of America. When we first organized the subcommittee, Congresswoman Fudge said we're going to have 5 to 7 of these hearings across the country. One has to be in Cleveland, and of course we knew that, and that's the way the chair operates. But we've had these hearings all across the country, from North Dakota all the way to Brownsville, Texas, and so it's our joy to be here today. Congresswoman Fudge is a member's member. I don't need to make a speech about Marcia Fudge because you know it better than I do. She is a great friend and a great leader. Our purpose here today, first let me set the record straight, is not a political visit. This is not a political rally. This is a very serious congressional hearing that we are conducting. Our purpose is to collect evidence across the country, and certainly here in Ohio, to substantiate or refute claims of voter suppression and disenfranchisement. We are eliciting evidence that will inform our debate when we take up the Voting Rights Act amendment and legislate to make voting more accessible. The Voting Rights Act, as we all know, passed Congress in 1965, days after my high school graduation. The VRA was needed to guarantee to African American citizens, particularly in the South, but not exclusively, the right to vote. It eliminated the literacy test. We often forget that, but the Voting Rights Act eliminated the literacy test and created many effective provisions, the most notable of which are Section 2 and Section 5. Section 2 granted minority communities a right of action to challenge discriminatory voting election systems. Though Section 2 litigation is expensive and very time-consuming, we have used Section 2 through the years to dismantle discriminatory barriers. The law is permanent, Section 2 is, and it is nationwide. In 1982, a bipartisan Congress amended Section 2 and eliminated the intent standard as a standard of proof. Section 5, by contrast, applied to certain states and parts of certain states that had a sorry history of preventing African Americans from voting. These covered jurisdictions were required to submit voting changes to the Department of Justice and demonstrate that the voting change is not discriminatory. That is a very expedited way of getting voting changes approved. It is free, and the burden is on the submitting jurisdiction to prove that it is not discriminatory. However, on June 25, 2013, the United States Supreme Court in the Shelby case handed down a decision that was devastating. Many of us did not fully understand it, but now we do. First of all, I need to set the record straight. It did find, the Shelby case did find Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to be constitutional, but it determined that the formula, Section 4 we call it, the formula was outdated and in need of amendment. And so the court has invited Congress to fix Section 4 and adopt a formula to require pre-clearance in jurisdictions that have fallen short using recent and relevant evidence. And so we've come today to hear the Ohio story because reports are not good. The reports that we get about Ohio are not good, to say the least. Hopefully we can craft good bipartisan legislation that will protect the right to vote, not just to African Americans or to Latino Americans or Asian Americans, but protect the right to vote for every American. And so I want to thank you to the chairman for your leadership. Thank you for your extraordinary leadership on this subject. And I look forward to the hearing as we go forward today. And since I have 55 seconds remaining, I too want to recognize a friend in the audience, Dr. Beverly Armstrong Norman, who is a young lady that grew up with me in North Carolina. We grew up together many, many years ago. Thank you, Beverly, for coming out today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin of Maryland.
Well, it's a great honor and a great privilege to be here in the beautiful 11th District of Ohio, home of our beloved Marsha Fudge, the chair of this subcommittee, and a very distinguished member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And I appreciate Mr. Davis's remarks, and I will try to pick up on the bipartisan theme by invoking a great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this has been the tantalizing, beautiful dream of American democracy. It's, of course, not the way that we started. We started as a slave republic of white male property owners over the age of 21, but it's been through social democratic struggle and constitutional and statutory changes that we've opened America up. So you can, in fact, look at our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all the amendments that have followed it as the chronicle of the expansion of our democracy. You know, we've had only 17 constitutional amendments since the original Bill of Rights. Most of them have dealt with the expansion of the suffrage and franchise, an attempt to perfect democracy. So the 15th Amendment eliminated discrimination in voting based on race. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of U.S. senators from the state legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment gave us women's suffrage. The 23rd Amendment said that people in the District of Columbia could vote for president. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. And then, of course, we've had, as Mr. Butterfield reminds us, the Voting Rights Act, which is an important part of our work here today to try to repair the damage that was visited upon it by a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court, essentially knocking the wind out of the Voting Rights Act by striking down the coverage formula which is necessary for the pre-clearance requirement to work. Now, I think that we have kind of dueling impulses in our society, going back to the beginning. On the one hand, nothing is more precious and beloved to us than the idea that every citizen has the right to vote. And that's the ideal embodied in that beautiful phrase, one person, one vote, which was the rallying slogan of Bob Moses and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi in the early 1960s, when they went at the great pains and great personal risk to themselves, door to door, trying to register people to vote in basically an apartheid state. And the Supreme Court adopted that language of one person, one vote in the one person, one vote cases, Reynolds versus Sims and Westbury versus Sanders. So that's a very deep part of our value system. But at the same time, we know that there have been recurrent efforts to keep people from voting, to stop people from voting, even while we have this value, this ideal that everybody should have the right to vote. And there have been repeated efforts to keep people from voting. And again, this has been a bipartisan thing. It's not one party or other. And certainly our party and our side of the aisle has a lot to repent for in terms of what it did in the middle of the 20th century in the southern states. But I'm proud of the fact that today we are very much the champions of giving every single citizen the right to vote and protecting that right to vote. I happen to think that the right to vote is too weak because we don't have in our Constitution what most of the constitutions of democratic countries around the world have, which is a universal affirmative grant of the right to vote to everybody. We have these anti-discrimination voting amendments like the 15th Amendment and like the 19th Amendment. You can't discriminate against this group, you can't discriminate against that group. But what we don't have is the affirmative grant of the right to everybody to vote and to be represented, which is why we have millions of unrepresented people, like people who live in Washington, D.C., the only residents of a national capital who aren't represented in their own national legislature. And we've got millions of former prisoners, people who live in the territories, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, who can't vote. So I think we've got some constitutional weakness here, and from that flows a structural weakness that's so decentralized and fragmented. So we've got to look at that as we try to repair the Voting Rights Act and move forward to make sure that everybody has the right to vote and to participate. I yield back, and thank you very much, Madam Chair, for convening us in Ohio.
Thank you. If you had noticed, Mr. Raskin is a former constitutional law professor. Now you know why. All that stuff's on the top of his head. We are going to begin with our testimony from our witnesses. Each witness will have 5 minutes to give us their testimony. You will see a light system. When the light turns green, you begin. When it turns yellow, you will have about 1 minute left of testimony. When it turns red, I would ask you to please start to wrap up. Let me introduce our witness for you today, Daniel Ortiz, who is the Outreach Director for Policy Matters Ohio. Mr. Ortiz joined Policy Matters Ohio in 2016, bringing 13 years' experience in organizing, campaign strategy, and education. Elaine So, did I pronounce it correctly? Sao, okay. Interim Chief Executive Officer of Asian Services in Action. In 2015, Asia, along with 15 other organizations across the state, launched the very first ever New American-focused civic engagement network focused on voter registration, voter education, and voter turnout. Mr. Tom Roberts, President, Ohio Conference of the NAACP. Mr. Roberts previously served as a member of the Ohio General Assembly, where he represented the interest of residents in the Dayton, Ohio area for more than 22 years. Mr. Ortiz, you are recognized.
Fudge, esteemed members of Congress and staff, thank you for convening these hearings and for the opportunity to testify about voting rights and election administration in Ohio. My name is Daniel Ortiz. I'm the Outreach Director for Policy Matters Ohio, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working for a more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Ohio. My experience with elections began when I joined my parents and when they went door-to-door canvassing for my father's first election to city council. Since then, I've organized youth with curriculum on the struggle for voting rights and worked professionally for political campaigns to coordinate voter protection programs. The integrity of our elections relies upon broad access to the vote, a transparent process to safeguard the integrity of the ballot, and straightforward access to the polls. Unfortunately, our country has a sad history of making it difficult for racial minorities and other groups to vote. The 2013 ruling of Shelby County v. Holder took away many protections, and the loss of pre-clearance for areas with historic voter disenfranchisement has opened a flurry of activity to depress voting. Reports of obstacles to voting, such as polling location closures, voter identification requirements, language access problems, mail delivery issues, low voter turnout rates, and flexible work schedules and transportation issues, are rampant. While these challenges are most widespread in states formerly protected by the Voting Rights Act, they are alive and real in Ohio as well. Ohio's struggles are not the same, but they are similar. In 2016, the legislature and then Secretary of State Husted eliminated Golden Week, the period when citizens could register to vote and cast an absentee ballot on the same day. Since then, Ohioans have experienced a steady and subtle erosion of our voting rights with devastating results. In Ohio, the closure of polling locations and consolidation of precincts, combined with the lack of reliable transportation options and paid time off from work, make it hard for many vulnerable communities to vote. Since 2012, Ohio has closed more than 300 polling locations across the state, a disproportionate number in urban areas. Reports from the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections show in that time period there were closures that eliminated 78 polling locations in Ohio's second largest county. That obstacle alone will sideline many voters, especially those who do not own cars. For decades, Ohio has underinvested in public transit, spending just 63 cents per capita on public transportation, ranking 40th among states. This presents an intersection of challenges to individuals with disabilities, people of color, and low-income people that is reminiscent of past struggles for civil rights. The 2018 Supreme Court decision of Husted v. A. Philip Randolph Institute made it easier for states to purge voters from the voting rolls. I'd like to echo the dissenting opinion of Justice Sotomayor that Congress crafted the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 with the understanding that while states are required to make a reasonable effort to remove ineligible voters from the registration list, such removal programs must be developed in a manner that prevents poor and illiterate voters from being caught in a purge system, which will require them to needlessly re-register and prevents abuse which has disparate impact on minority communities. Sotomayor goes on to point out that a majority African-American neighborhood of Cincinnati had 10% of their voters removed for inactivity, compared to only 4% of voters in suburban neighborhoods. Most people who follow campaigns and elections will attest to you that you win in the margins. This partisan urge to lock in an electoral advantage by manipulating the law will continue until there are new laws to stop it. In my work to support community voter education initiatives, I find that Spanish language resources are often lacking and staffing levels are low. Our nation's current atmosphere of fear and intimidation threatens to reduce civic participation in the growing Latino electorate. This is especially true for Ohio's Latino community and the recent arrivals coming from Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is currently in the midst of a migratory wave with 500,000 people leaving the island between 2006 and 2016, and as many as 176,000 people migrating to the mainland United States in the one-year aftermath of Hurricane Maria. This will likely eclipse the wave of migration that brought my parents to Ohio in the 1950s. Prior to the hurricane, Ohio's Puerto Rican population nearly doubled in size between 2000 and 2017, growing from 66,000 to just below 125,000. Ohio's Puerto Rican population is considerably younger, less educated, and more likely to be poor compared to Puerto Ricans on the island or in other states. Over 18% of Puerto Ricans in Ohio reported speaking English less than very well. In Northeast Ohio, many recent arrivals' biggest concern is the struggle to find stable, long-term housing. The instability, combined with Ohio's system to purge voters, is a cause for concern for anyone who cares about the voice of the diaspora community and would like to see more active participants in our democracy. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but differences in Ohio's electoral process, coupled with a lack of appropriate cultural context in most civic education initiatives, will lead to low participation rates. Any changes to the Voting Rights Act should reinstate pre-clearance and expand it in their coverage to states like Ohio. Voting somewhere near your home, on a major transit line, with a ballot in your most familiar language should be the norm, not the exception. We should be making it easier to vote. Voters should not have to worry about what rights they're losing between elections. if their early voting period is being cut, whether they have been purged from the voter rolls and need to re-register, if their polling location has been shut down or combined, and how far they will have to travel to vote. I cannot tell you what the future of the Voting Rights Act looks like, but I do ask that you consider what justice looks like. Help us bridge the divide. Consider solutions for those most burdened people in high poverty, with language barriers, with low educational attainment, and less experience voting. If we make our elections work for them, our county, state, and country will be better for it. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sal.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, committee members, and staff for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Elaine Tsao. I am the interim co-CEO of Asian Services in Action, and I am here today to speak on behalf of the community we serve. Asian Services in Action, also known by the acronym ASIA, provides services to immigrants and refugees in Northeast Ohio. ASIA was founded in 1995 by 4 women who saw a need to improve the quality of life for Asians and Pacific Islanders in Northeast Ohio. Today, the organization is the largest Asian American and Pacific Islander-focused health and social service 501c3 organization in the state of Ohio. Each year, ASIA serves tens of thousands of individuals and families at its offices located in Cleveland and Akron, Ohio. These services include culturally and linguistically focused medical care provided through our federally qualified health center, as well as wraparound social services so that each client is treated holistically according to their individual needs. ASIA serves some of the most vulnerable members of the community, newcomers to this country who are learning how to navigate and adjust to a new environment with different rules and unfamiliar procedures. ASIA's mission is to reduce barriers and obstacles for new arrivals to this country and empower them to contribute to the strengthening and growth of America. According to a 2018 report from the Ohio Development Services Agency, Ohio's Asian American community consists of more than 324,000 people. In 2012, Asia's New American Civic Engagement Project began. It was part of an effort to increase Asian American Pacific Islander participation in the presidential election. This work grew into a movement to educate and push for civic participation among new American communities throughout Ohio and is now known as the ACE Network. Through the ACE Network, ASIA has supported numerous community-based organizations, ethnic groups, and student associations to increase voter participation and civic engagement within the AAPI community. As voting is the foundation of democracy in this country, ASIA strives to ensure that new Americans are included in this process. Significant investment of resources and collaborative effort has been made to increase voter turnout in the state of Ohio in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. This year, ASIA is working with 15 diverse partners across the state who are organizing at the grassroots level to register and turn out new low-propensity voters. In 2018, in partnership with members of the ACE Network, ASIA contacted over 36,000 registered voters across the state. For many members of the immigrant and refugee population that ASIA serves, the right to vote is a new and unfamiliar experience. A refugee, almost by definition, comes from a country where the institutions necessary to protect the freedom and safety of citizens have failed or have never existed. In that context, many of ASIA's clients arrived in this country with little understanding of the features of a functioning democracy. Some of ASIA's clients have not even voted in their countries of origin. So ASIA's civic engagement team not only registers new voters, they also educate new Americans about the voting process. Additionally, some members of the new American community have language challenges with limited English proficiency. The combination of voting being a new concept for the new American community, plus a language challenge, magnify the effect of any barrier to voting. So frequent changes to election administration procedure has a disproportionate effect on new Americans. Therefore, it is important for the government to consider the impact that these challenges have on what should otherwise be free, fair, and equitable access to the right to vote. I say equitable because what is needed for fair access to voting may be different for a new American than for someone who has lived in this country for a long time. I will stop here because time is running out, but I will welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady Fudge and Ranking Member Davis. Thank you for being here in the state of Ohio, the Buckeye State. As some of you may know, we often say that the road to the presidency comes through the state of Ohio. And for many of us, that has been true for many, many, many years. First of all, I want to bring you greetings on behalf of our Washington Bureau President Hillary Shelton, who's dealt with many of you at our nation's capital. As you know, the NAACP was founded in 1909. It's our nation's oldest, largest, and most widely recognized grassroots civil rights organization. And despite the fact that African Americans and other racial and ethnic groups are guaranteed the right to vote by the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, states like Ohio are using outright intimidation to stop people from casting free and unfettered ballots. I want to share with you some of what's going on in Ohio. There are many other issues I could share with you, but I want to pick these three because they deal specifically in your role as members of the U.S. Congress. I think that's what I was asked to share with you. The first of one is purging. In 2006, Ohio had 7,860,052 registered voters. At that time, 416,744 registered voters, that is 5.35% of those total, were removed or deleted from the rolls in 2006. The number of voters purged very significantly, ranged as low as, in your district, Madam Chair, 20,353 registered were removed from the rolls in 1998 and 99. In the state capital, Franklin, Ohio, 4 years were removed, 170,000 names were removed from the rolls. Let me flip that. Madam, yours was 170,000. Franklin was the 20,000.
Correct.
From the low to the high. All of the purging voting was done as part of a so-called annual voter roll maintenance process required by what we all thought was a positive law, the National Voter Registration Act. Ohio Secretary of State was canceling these registrations. The supplemental process targeted voters who did not vote in 2 consecutive federal elections. Voters purged in the process often did not see and often showed up at the polls and realized they were not able to vote. This required groups like, and some of them are present today, Ohio's A. Philip Randolph Institute to file a lawsuit against the Ohio Secretary of State. The case ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unfortunately ruled on behalf of Ohio's Secretary of State. In the end, the U.S. Supreme Court decision allows states to treat the fundamental right to vote as a use it or lose it right. Let me talk about the other one that I think Chair Lady shared. Golden Week was created in 2005 with new early voting legislation that allowed voters to cast absentee ballots up to 35 days before the election. This allowed for a week of overlapping with the deadline of voter registration. The number of people who took advantage of this opportunity was considerable. During the 2012 general election, approximately 90,000 people cast votes during Golden Week, which translates to about 14% of the total early voting. Golden Week and early voting opportunities have been much debate in the state of Ohio and others. In 2014, the Ohio House passed House Bill 238, which eliminated Golden Week, followed by a directive from the Secretary of State setting widely early voting hours to be used in the forthcoming election. Shortly afterwards, the NAACP, with the help of ACLU, filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of State. In 2015, a compromise was reached in which Husted agreed to restore some weekend evenings to voting hours. This agreement expired when Secretary of State was elected to Lieutenant Governor. Restrictive legislation is this third issue. Since 2013, members of the Ohio General Assembly have introduced no less than 9 bills to restrict voting in the state of Ohio. Madam Chair, members of the committee, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Just a warning to everyone, we are being live streamed nationally, so sometimes the camera is on us and sometimes it's on you. So just giving you a heads up about that. Yeah, okay. With that, we will begin our questioning. And I will move to Mr. Butterfield, and I will save my comments until the end. Mr. Butterfield, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. You got to me pretty quickly. First of all, let me thank the panelists for your testimony today. It has been very insightful, and if you didn't get to portions of your testimony, it will certainly be included in the record. And as I said in my opening statement, this is an official congressional hearing. And so your remarks today are officially in the record of the House of Representatives and will be used as we take up legislation in the upcoming months. And so thank you so very much. Let me start off with you, Mr. Ortiz. Your testimony, I read a portion of it in my binder and listened to you here today. And obviously, you're very hands-on, and just thank you for your activism. Well, first of all, you said that Section 5 does not apply to the state of Ohio. It never has. But Section 2 does. Section 2 is nationwide, and it gives minority communities the right to litigate whenever they feel that their votes are being diluted. Have there been instances of Section 2 litigation in Ohio? Yeah.
I cannot speak to that.
Do any of the others of you, I know NAACP in other states has been very active in Section 2 litigation, at least the Legal Defense Fund has. Do you know, Mr. Roberts, if there's been litigation in Ohio?
I'm not aware of it, but I'm almost believe there was at some point, but I can't speak to it.
And to the second panelist?
Yes, I'm not aware of any, and that's outside of the scope of the work that Asian Services does, but I would be happy to find that information.
Thank you very much. And we're not being rude to witnesses when we cut them off like this. This is kind of the way we do it. We have 5 minutes to cram all of this stuff in, and so don't think we're being disrespectful when that happens. In reading the material and just watching Ohio politics over the years, it seems that there are constant changes in your election laws. Nothing is static. Nothing stays the same. And it seems to me that I like to call these second-generation barriers. Anytime you talk about purging voter rolls, I mean, I don't even know why it's necessary to purge a voting roll. They're not being done by hand. They're being done electronically. And so if you have people who just happen to be inactive, they may just decide, well, I'm not going to vote again until I have someone on the ballot that I want to vote for. And so they may just choose to sit out for 2 or 3 elections. And so the voter purge evidence that I've heard is very disconcerting. Early voting, that seems to be a trend across the country, not just in Ohio, but a trend everywhere, because that there are groups of people in our country who want to suppress votes of people who will not likely vote for their political party, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I mean, this thing can go in either direction. But there seems to be a concerted effort on the part of groups of people across the country to do very subtle things. They're not trying to eliminate the right to vote. They want to suppress the right to vote. And so if a purge disproportionately affects a minority community versus a majority community, or an early voting change disproportionately affects one community over another, then that's where the focus seems to be, and that is what we call voter suppression. and it appears to be happening in this great state. And so we've got to find a way to level the playing field to make sure that all of our voters get an equal opportunity to participate. Am I wrong in believing that there's just been constant changes in your election laws, Mr. Roberts?
Chair Lady Fudge, Congressman, you're absolutely correct. To date, 270,000 voters have been purged from the voting roll. When I mentioned the 9, let me just tell you, House Senate Bill 47 made it difficult for voters to repeal unpopular laws. This is the initiative that we are guaranteed under the Constitution of Ohio. One of my former colleagues in Cincinnati, because the polls, I think, opened up late, he got a court to allow extension. Legislation was introduced to attempt to make it more difficult to keep these polls open, even though it was a technical reason for that happening.
Let me get to my final question then. Do you see any emerging issues, voting issues that may be surfacing? I know redistricting is right around the corner and the census is on the horizon. Do you see any emerging issues that we haven't talked about today? Yes.
Well,
Yes.
one issue that I think we didn't talk about extensively is there was a bill that the Ohio General Assembly considered to reduce the number of poll workers per precinct from 4 to 2, and that would disproportionately impact anyone who needed additional assistance at the polls, whether that's inviting a helper for a limited English proficient voter, or just anyone who needs an accommodation of some sort, because that would need some approval from a poll worker.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I yield back.
Ranking Member Davis.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fudge. And thanks again to the witnesses. I enjoyed listening to your testimony. It's a privilege for me to represent Central Illinois. And Mr. Roberts, Springfield, Illinois, particularly in my district, is the birthplace of the NAACP. We're working to take artifacts that were unearthed during the project of the race riots of 1908, which began the movement toward the NAACP, and get those artifacts into the Smithsonian Museum of African American History. So when we are successful, I hope you can join me out there. Thank you for your service, and thanks for your testimony. I also have a chance to represent part of Abe Lincoln's old congressional district, where he served as a member of the Whig Party for one term. There's a joke in Illinois that in some parts of Illinois, Abe probably could still cast a vote. So when we're talking about voter maintenance issues, that's, I guess we've got to figure out a process. How do you move deceased voters from the rolls? Voter list maintenance, Mr. Roberts, is a practice used by 44 other states, and it's actually required by the National Voter Registration Act. And as your testimony and the testimony of others have stated, it's been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. And additionally, the state of Ohio has an extremely low error rate. The error rate is 0.001% with their practices. Yet all three of you are opposed to Ohio's list maintenance. Please, how do you square this, Mr. Roberts?
Thank you, Ranking Member. And let me just say, under the leadership of Illinois' President Teresa Haley, we've been to Springfield last year for a regional meeting, so I'm very familiar with your artifacts there. I think the answer would be it's not the issue of dead people, because Ohio law is clear on how that is taken care of. I think it goes to one of the other comments, and that is, if I choose not to vote, there's no way in the world that I should be taken off the rolls. One of my former colleagues in the House said we should have put on the panel none of the above, because that should give me an opportunity to say I don't like that person. So I think that's not the issue. It's not the dead people. It's that I should have the choice to vote or not vote and not be removed from the rolls.
Don't you? I mean, Ohio's different than Illinois, so I'm learning too from your testimony about other states' practices. But the state legislature can't offer a choice of none of the above. The state legislature can offer some additional, opportunities. And from what I've seen in my research, there have been multiple times where the voter list registration, and the Secretary of State has gone above and beyond to send mailers out. Doesn't the voter also have the chance to send that back to verify that, hey, I do live here?
If I may, I can speak to just an illustration. So there are, we're aware of a voter, they were not directly counseled by Asia, but we are aware of a voter who worked in a submarine away from his Ohio residence for many months. You know, like majority of the year he was working on this submarine. And the official notice came, you know, after a period of inactivity to his residence that he intended to return to after his service. And it's situations like that where, you know, the period of inactivity having nothing to do with an intention or non-intention to remain on the roll.
Are you aware of that individual not getting a chance to cast a vote?
Yes.
So that individual was not able to vote.
They were purged. That individual was purged from the roll and then had to re-register.
But was that individual stopped from voting in that particular election that you were counseling him on?
We did not counsel this individual. This is something that we are aware of.
Do you know whether or not he was able to vote in a future election?
I do not.
Okay. Mr. Ortiz, you mentioned that the national trends are that voter turnout is lower. I don't think that squares with the facts. I think you look at this recent midterm, voter turnout was at exceptionally high levels. We were in North Dakota recently where they have they don't even have a voting registration system. And there was record turnout in the midterm election. Can you clarify that comment for me?
No, thank you for the question. I would speak to some of the points that you've made. I think when we look at the process for purges, I don't disagree that people are given opportunities to reply to a postcard. But when we have such a very quick process to bring people into that pipeline of potential purge, depending on how that data gets shared, we need to review to see if that's being done equitably, if it's being done to where all folks in a county, regardless of which neighborhoods they're living in, are being brought into that process. And then also there is some concern that certain communities will be intimidated by written correspondence from government, and that could be something that they may be less likely or inclined to reply to.
Does that, we're going to have government mailers from the IRS, Selective Service. You know, are they, if they're intimidated, do they not have to respond to those?
It's not that they don't have to respond to those. I think it's also that we need to have adequate services and funding for people to make sure that there's clarity in how we're communicating, that things are being communicated in languages that are going to speak to the folks who are receiving those mailers, and that there are staff that can answer questions to clarify and dispel myths. I think that sometimes the active imagination of what's going on in our politics can get the best of us, and many people can have a distorted view of what's happening with our government. And I think it's upon all of us to help explain with a very clear and transparent process how their voices need to be heard, and they are a part of this process as citizens of this country.
Yield back. I don't have any time to yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Sorry.
So, Mr. Roberts, let me start with you. Do people have a constitutional right to vote, we think, under the Equal Protection Clause? Do people have a constitutional right not to vote?
Madam Chair, Representative, I think so. I think they have a right to
Okay,
vote.
so if people have a constitutional right to vote, but you throw them off the rolls for not voting, you've basically violated their right not to vote by denying their right to vote. Right?
Yes.
So you testified that hundreds of thousands of people were purged from the rolls, removed by this statewide mechanism. And it's not just a question of some people not wanting to vote, not liking the choices. Ohio doesn't make it particularly easy to vote, does it? I mean, it's not very easy to vote in America generally. We don't do it on the weekend. We do it on a weekday. Working people have to go work. They got to drop the kids off at school. They got to pick the kids up from school. You got to get dinner ready. There's not a lot of time to vote. And then, as I understand it, I'm getting testimony that the legislature cut early voting days in half. It eliminated the requirement that poll workers direct people to the right precinct if their precinct place has moved, and the last weekend of early voting was eliminated. So they're restricting people's ability to go vote. Then if they don't vote, then they use that as a reason to take them off of the rolls for the next election. And if they miss the postcard or it gets lost in a stack of bills or something, tough luck. Mr. Davis suggested that the error rate was 0.01%, which is remarkable to me. If that's true, I would love to.
0.001.
Say it again?
0.001.
0.001. So I'm reading that to be 1 in 100,000 people. They purged 400,000 people, and only 4 people were falsely purged. I mean, that's hard. It's hard for me to believe, but I mean, I would love to see some documentation of that. It just strikes me as an extraordinary practice, you know. And Mr. Davis said something I really agreed with at the beginning. He said that the principal antagonist to the right to vote is partisanship. And again, that applies across the board. There's no clean hands in American history when it comes to trying to deprive people of the right to vote based on partisanship. But, you know, I know of Ohio. It is the pathway to the presidency. It's produced, 7 presidents of its own. It is a very closely divided state. My beloved friend Marcy Kaptur keeps me apprised of what's going on in Ohio politics. You've got one progressive Democratic senator. You've got one conservative Republican senator. It's a basically 50-50 state, but when you look at the congressional delegation, it's 12-4 because it's been so heavily gerrymandered. Now, that's not just a Republican problem, because in my state, which is a Democratic state, we got 7 Democrats and 1 Republican. I'm opposed to gerrymandering across the board. That's why I'm proud I voted for H.R. 1, which eliminates gerrymandering by mandating independent redistricting commissions in every state in the country. But even if we could live with the gerrymandering for a while until we get rid of it, certainly we can't live with the gerrymandering of elections by throwing hundreds of thousands of people off of the rolls when they've got a right to vote. That's a very different kind of thing. So what are the efforts in Ohio to stop this practice? What's going on? Mr. Ortiz, you're involved in it. Is there any hope of ending this practice of these systematic purges of voters?
I would say that we can continue to organize. We're going to work with our coalition partners to make sure that this is something that we can bring more voice to, more awareness to. I know that with specific regard to the point on gerrymandering, that's also something that Ohio has begun to address with ballot initiatives and that have passed and been successful to make changes to how we are going to redistrict going into 2020 and beyond.
I mean, gerrymandering does look like a really important obstacle to full voting rights. If one party, whatever it is, the purple party, the red party, the blue, one party gets in control, then they can slice the deck in such a way that they end up with not a 2-to-1 advantage, a 3-to-1 advantage in the state's congressional delegation and in the state something like that in the state legislative makeup. And then they use that to pass laws that make it more difficult for people to vote, not just in their district election, but statewide election. That's a serious dysfunction in the democracy, right? So I don't know, Mr. Roberts, if you would comment on what could be done about this.
NAACP, League of Women Voters, and Environmental Council, many others worked together to have the legislature pass what we thought was very progressive gerrymandering legislation. The proof is in what happens in 2021, what happens. And so I think we have passed that legislation. We'll see what happens. Ohio has addressed those issues, and I just want to say that the current Secretary of State is a little more receptive to working with various groups than the previous Secretary of State.
I yield back. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is an honor to be here with you in the county we share.
Yes.
And, the dean of our delegation, Marcy Kaptur, as well as my friend Anthony, and the rest of our members that welcome aboard. It just goes to show you that Northeastern Ohio, we all work together. And I have 2 quick questions, and I will defer the rest of my time to Representative Davis. Mr. Ortiz, if I heard you correctly, you said that there's a uptick, if you will, in Hispanic voters. Is it not true that Lorain and Cuyahoga County both offer bilingual ballots?
That is true.
Okay, thank you. I just want to clarify that. And Ms. So? I'm sorry. So, you had brought up the fact that there's bills reducing the poll workers from 4 to 2. Isn't it a fact that we're having a problem finding poll workers, that is part of that process? So in order to make sure we can run the elections, that if we reduce the number of poll workers, we'll be allowed to run the election more efficiently?
I think that that's part of the infrastructure in the state of Ohio that perhaps needs to be enhanced or strengthened. Perhaps if there was additional funding for additional poll workers, then it would be able to recruit more poll workers. I know that in our community, we actively encourage our community members to be poll workers.
Well, I know from my time as a prosecuting attorney that it's you're about minimum wage for all the work that you put in by the time you're through if a day as a poll worker, and I know it's really hard to recruit them. I defer back to my colleague, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. I wanted to give the figures that got us to the .001 error rate. New Secretary of State, Secretary LaRose, sent an additional mailing to try and re-register 270,000 that did not respond to the voter maintenance list mailer. 540 responded. 540 people responded. And when you look at voter turnout, you look at list maintenance processes, I asked the question last time, how do our local officials abide by the law, abide by the Supreme Court decision that was a decision based upon a suit filed here in Ohio? What is their choice? And what have they done lately? I know, Mr. Roberts, you gave us some statistics, but the most recent one was 13 years ago, in 2006. The other statistics you gave us were 20 years ago. What about now?
Madam Chair and to Congress, I think the panel after us will have a lot more details because they're dealing with it intimately. So I think they will have those numbers they can share with you.
Well, I certainly hope so, because statistics from 2006 and from 1998 and 1999 aren't as relevant today. And I'd like to, for our knowledge and for the record, to understand what's happening today. And I'm glad you mentioned Secretary LaRose is open to working with you. I think his office spent $130,000 to send an extra mailer out to get only 540 responses. And Mr. Ortiz, now I know you didn't clarify about voter turnout being trending lower. I want to give you another chance to clarify your comments on low voter turnout when clearly the facts are that voter turnout is up nationwide and up here in Ohio, even in predominantly minority precincts.
Madam Chair, Congressman, yes, voter turnout was up in the 2018 election. I would also say that, to the question that you impose on the purges, I think to the earlier point that I made citing Justice Sotomayor, that we need to be looking at this and make that reasonable effort that any people removed, any ineligible voters are done so, and we develop processes that prevent poor and illiterate voters specifically, from being caught in this purge system. So I am familiar with the statistics that you shared on the response rates from the mailer from Secretary of State LaRose, but I do think that we aren't being mindful of all the challenges certain communities that may be receiving this mailer face.
Well, again, government mailers come all the time. Folks, no matter where they are, what their literacy level is, unfortunately don't get a break if they don't respond to the IRS. We've seen your local officials send multiple mailers out, and we got a .001 response rate. I think the local officials are doing their job. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand. With the census coming up, we're going to get an accurate count of all the folks that live in each of our states. Raise your hand if you think it's okay. Raise your hand if you think it's okay to have more registered voters in counties than people who are actually counted in the census. It does when you don't maintain your voter lists, because we have counties in my home state of Illinois that have more people registered to vote than were counted in the census. That is a problem. Is that an okay process? Raise your hand if you think it's okay. All right, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Capter? You can get to it when you get to it. Ms. Capter?
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to say to those from Ohio here today, we are so proud of Marcia Fudge that she has the gavel for this committee for the country. We are so proud of her. Thank you, Marcia. We know through your mother, who, by the way, comes to my congressional district, too, to every meeting, right, how hard she works as well for the interests of our country and for the greater Cleveland and Ohio communities. I wanted to offer some perspective. When I was born a few years ago, Ohio, the nation had 146 million people. We are headed to, we're over 325 million now, headed to 350 million. So, Ranking Member Davis, we thank you for traveling a great distance to be here, and all of the members of this subcommittee, obviously. But it is sort of obvious that you're going to have more people voting when your population has doubled and tripled. And we are, hopefully we'll have more people voting. By 2050, we'll be up to about 350 million, or it could be over that as a country. So I think population growth accounts for additional voters, and also that we work very hard to register people. But I wanted to give some perspective. What troubles me about the system that's been set in place in Ohio, when I was a little girl, we used to be able to walk to the precinct, and I would go with our mother, and it's one of my precious memories. The PTA would have a cupcake sale. That's probably why I went. And Mom would hold me up. In those days, we had paper ballots. And I would be able to mark the X for her. That's probably why I'm in Congress. But I remember that she would give the ballot to our neighbor, who was a Republican. And he would put it in the box. And I would leave there completely perplexed, not understanding why our mother would do that. But voting was very personal. We knew everybody at the voting table, the booth workers. They were from our neighborhood. What has changed so dramatically over the years, even where I vote, is that our precinct has now been moved multiple times. The street that I live on was sliced right down the middle, and I don't think it was by accident. When, unfortunately, a few years ago, I was forced to be in a runoff with a congressman from Cleveland named Dennis Kucinich. The mapping that was done in Columbus by a legislature controlled by the opposite party drew the line around his house and my house. So I'm trained as a city planner. I pay attention to maps. And I thought, they've got it down to the granular level. And what has happened in the region where I vote, now we have to drive to go to the precinct. So mothers in my neighborhood and fathers can't walk their children to the polls like we used to do. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. I represent Lorain, Ohio. It has no transit. How are people supposed to vote? I hope that this committee considers how to endorse community at the most local level as precinct lines are drawn. Because what is going on is wrong for our country. The other thing that's been happening in Ohio, our booth workers are shifted. So rather than someone from my neighborhood being hired to work right there, they take someone they hire from my neighborhood and put them in a totally unfamiliar place. This is amazing. It can't only be happening where I live. It has to be happening in thousands of precincts across this state. So when we used to walk into the precinct, people would know who we were because they were our neighbors. And yes, they were Republican, and yes, they were Democrat, but it was community. And I think there's something really gone afoul in this state, that we are becoming almost faceless. in the voting process. So I'm sure my time has expired, but I just want to say...
you get 25 seconds.
I got 25 seconds left. I just think that we need local training of booth workers. We need to go back and see where people actually live, use the schools as a way of measuring that, but don't provide all this disruption to people. And in the poorest neighborhoods I represent, I guarantee you that in many communities I represent, when the children come to school in September, by the next May, there are the same number of children in the school, but 2/3 to 3/4 of the children have changed. In the most low-income communities I represent, they have a right to vote too. And we have to figure out a way to deal with our provisional ballot situation much more efficiently, and we have to have people in those precincts who know the neighborhoods. Thank you so very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Our newest member of our delegation, Mr. Gonzalez.
First of all, I want to thank Chairwoman Fudge, my new friend, for bringing this hearing to Cleveland, Ranking Member Davis, Tri-C for hosting us today, and everybody for being here. Additionally, I'd like to thank all the witnesses for taking the time to be here and discuss this important issue. The opportunity to participate in democracy by casting a ballot is one of the most important and fundamental rights in this country. My grandparents fled communist Cuba and the Castro regime because they believed in the strength of our values and the strength of our Constitution. The belief in the right to vote, after watching what happens to a country when that right does not exist, was central to the inspiration that led them to our great nation, and is frankly why I'm sitting in this chair. Just recently, I had the opportunity to participate in a civil rights pilgrimage in Alabama, led by the legendary John Lewis. There have been few experiences in my life that have been as impactful as seeing this painful part of our history through his eyes, as he and his civil rights brothers and sisters fought to gain the promises enshrined in our founding documents. America's democracy is healthy and strong when everyone who has the right to vote uses that right freely and securely. Ohio's had a storied history in federal elections as a swing state, often playing a major role in determining the winner in presidential elections. I was glad to see my friend Frank LaRose elected to the Secretary of State position last November to take over as Chief Election Officer in Ohio. I believe that it's worth noting that this past election set a record for the highest turnout in a midterm in the history of our state. We've never had more voters. As a state legislator, Frank led the fight on reforming our redistricting process and also to expand registration options to include online registration. Just yesterday, he announced a bipartisan initiative to ensure that when a citizen updates their information at the state in one place, say on tax filings, that the new address will be automatically transferred to the Secretary of State office as well for updating on the voter rolls. This will ensure that more people are kept on the rolls and are being properly counted. While I recognize that there's always room for improvement, I would like to highlight several aspects of the Ohio election system that I feel are particularly strong. At 28 days, Ohio currently offers one of the longest early voting periods in the nation, providing flexibility to voters who are unable to vote on Election Day. This even includes early voting on weekends. Additionally, Ohio has no excuse absentee ballot voting, meaning that voters are able to vote absentee even without a stated reason. It's not the practice across the country. Practices like this encourage participation in our democracy, and I'm proud that Ohio has been an example for other states who currently have not enacted these policies. In turning to questions, I just have just a couple, and then I'll turn it back over to Mr. Davis if we have time. Mr. Ortiz, I want to get back to something you said, which is that voter suppression reduced the vote in the Latino community in the previous election. Can you share the data with that specific claim?
So, Madam Chair, Congressman, thank you for the question. I would say that there's a number of data sources that I can share after this and follow up. But I will also say I appreciate hearing your story, and I think as a child of immigrants, you can appreciate that right now the atmosphere in our country is particularly challenging. Just earlier this week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments talking about the Voting Rights Act, and specific as it relates to this upcoming census and the addition of a citizenship question. Many advocates across the country are united in thinking that this is going to actually produce a depressed count. And when everyone doesn't count on the census, that turns all sorts of data that's reliable, that everyone uses, regardless of what side of the aisle, whether you're working in business or for the public good, we all rely on that data. So with that as a prospect on the horizon, and forming the mood of specific folks in the Latino community who may not have the same experience that you had, but who maybe are the descendants of immigrants who feel intimidated. It could provide a shift in how folks view communications from government. So I do think that it's something that we need to be mindful of on how that can be a disruption for all sorts of things, including appropriations.
I don't mean to interrupt. My time is going to expire in a second. Just to verify, just really quickly, the claim that Latino turnout was down as a result of voter suppression, do you have the data source for that specific claim?
I will follow up with additional data sources.
Please, I look forward to that, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, to my colleague that represents not only Shelby County, but Selma, Alabama, Terry Sewell from Alabama.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's field hearing, including our extraordinary panelists who've committed themselves to the great work of making sure that our civil rights and our voting rights for every American is ensured. I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues on the House Admin Committee, the Subcommittee on Elections, for allowing me to be here today, even though I'm not on the committee, especially the chairwoman, Marcia Fudge, for her leadership on the issue of voting rights. I am the chief sponsor of H.R. 4, and H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, is a seminal piece of legislation which seeks to restore Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I have the great honor of not only representing Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes Birmingham, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I know that people in my district bled, fought, prayed, marched, and many died for the right to vote for all Americans in this great nation. It is important to me, and I know it is important to all of the panelists here today, as well as to my colleagues on the desk, that we get to the bottom of why it is that people are not voting in the numbers that they should be voting. The reality is that we live in a society where human nature being human nature, we've realized that by restricting the opportunity to vote to some people in the society, we actually can change elections. That's just a fact. Now, what do we do about that fact? I think it's important that we realize that the fundamental base of our democracy is the right to vote. Also, the right not to vote. But it's important that we realize that you don't lose that right to vote simply by not voting. I think that there are several myths here that I'd like to challenge. The first myth is just because you have higher turnout and higher voter registration doesn't mean that we don't have voter suppression. Let me repeat that. As Marcy Kaptur so eloquently said, she knows better about the population in Ohio than I do. The population of Ohio has grown exponentially. So you would think that the number of people voting, registering to vote, turning out to vote would also increase. But that nevertheless doesn't invalidate the fact that in certain vulnerable communities, it's harder to vote. What do I mean by that? You know, just because we no longer have to count how many marbles are in a jar, or if you saw the movie Selma, recite how many counties, all 67 counties, in order to register to vote, doesn't mean that state legislatures across this country are not imposing harder barriers for people to vote. In North Dakota, this committee was just there. Instead of allowing people to register to vote by any mailing address that they have, the state legislature imposed a physical address requirement. It should not be surprising to you, although I'm sure it was not intentional by that legislature, that tribal lands and those Native Americans that live on tribal lands often vote by P.O. box, not physical address. Now, I am sure that the state of North Dakota's voter rolls are much higher than they were in the 60s. I am sure that the state of North Dakota's voter registrations are higher than they were in the 60s, probably record high since their population has grown. but that nevertheless does not invalidate the fact that by only looking at physical addresses to be able to register to vote in that state doesn't cause voter suppression. Let's be clear. We should be, especially as elected officials, all about making sure that it's easier for people to vote, not harder for people to vote. I think of my own state, the state of Alabama, where my dad, who recently passed, he was able to vote the latter part of his years after a massive stroke by a validly issued federal ID called a Social Security card. But after the Shelby decision, it just so happens that the state of Alabama state legislature changed the requirements of what's required in order to go and vote. The ID that you can show now does not include a federal ID called a Social Security card. Rather, now it includes a much more limited number of IDs. I find it to be really hard to believe that you can't show a University of Alabama ID, but you can show a hunting license ID and go and vote. The state of Alabama is picking and choosing who should vote. They're prioritizing hunters over students, and it's wrong. So I want to thank this committee for allowing us to see in real time and go out in the field and talk to constituents, talk to voters, non-voters, those who wish they could vote because they don't have transportation. We have to think about all the reasons why people don't vote, and we should be encouraging that instead of limiting access to the polls. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to participate today.
I want to thank this first panel, and I want to thank all of my colleagues as well. And I just want to wrap up by saying a few things. We are as segregated and separated in this country today as we were in 1968. Our schools are more segregated. Our neighborhoods are more segregated. And so I think it's important that we understand what is happening in this country today. And I think that when Justice Roberts wrote his opinion in Shelby, the things that he said that I agree with is that there is still discrimination in this country. What he said was that the information and the data that we had was old. He said there are still places that need to be pre-cleared, but we need contemporaneous new data. That is what we're doing here today and around the country, is collecting the data. He did not believe for a minute that everybody is treated fairly in this country and that the right to vote is the same for everybody in this country. He's the Supreme Court Justice. So I agree with him on that there is still discrimination and we need to address it. You know, it's interesting that we talk about the numbers of people voting. Because we vote in spite of difficulties, don't make those difficulties right. I mean, just because the bar is raised and we have to find a way to jump over it, it doesn't make right that we go to Standing Rock a week ago and they tell us that they are voting at chicken coops. That we go to Brownsville, Texas, and they tell us that they are voting in police stations, knowing that the people who live in those communities are afraid of the police. It doesn't make a difference when we talk about all of the things that, and I happen to like LaRose, so I'm really pleased that he is the Secretary of State. But the former one, you know, you would send us postcards that look like junk mail. Who looks at that? That's the first thing. It looks like junk mail. The second thing is that he would believe that we should treat everybody exactly the same. Now, in theory, that makes some sense, except for that if I live in a county with 1 million people and I have one place to vote with 30 parking spaces, and somebody that lives in a county with 5,000 people has one place to vote with 30 parking spaces, is that fair to me? Absolutely not. So equity and fairness are two very different things, and we have to understand the difference. Also, the poor are disproportionately hurt because poor people move more, so they don't get the junk mail. We don't have permanent housing. And if you look at places like Standing Rock, where most people do not drive, what do they need a driver's license for? What do they need a particular ID for? So when we make them go and get one, it is a poll tax. If we make them go and buy a $15 ID, it is a poll tax. That is exactly what it is. And so I think it's important that we understand what we are doing in the name of democracy. We will support democracy in Venezuela, in Russia, in China, every place but here. We should be making the franchise open to everyone as opposed to trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. And every time we change the rules, which we do at every single election, we make it more difficult for people to vote. If you're confused about what day you can vote, it is suppressing your vote. Now, is it incumbent upon us to know the rules? Yes, it is. But I would suggest to you that as elected officials, it is our responsibility to make sure that every American feels that they have the unfettered, unabridged right to vote. We should not say, because you didn't vote today, I'm not going to let you vote next week. The Constitution says you have a right to vote. It doesn't say if you don't vote, I'm going to take it from you. So let's talk about what the Constitution says. Jamie, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I know a little bit about it. The Constitution gives us the right. And if we are going to be the kind of Americans we say we are, then America needs to live up to its promise, and Ohio needs to live up to its promise. And that is to be sure that everyone who is qualified and wishes to vote can vote. I thank you all so very, very much for your testimony. Guys, you can tell I'm at home. We thank you, and if the next set of witnesses would please join us. Thank you all so much. Oh, you know what, let me do this while they're getting up. There are a number of elected officials here, judges, council people. I saw the majority leader of city council. Just all the elected officials, just stand up, would you please? The State Department of Education. It's a lot of people here. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay.
Don't wait for me.
All right. Panel, so please take your seats. Hello. Everybody, there is a second panel, so please take your seats so we can get started as quickly as possible. Please take your seats.
We're hoping you'll re-co-sponsor
Thanks.
HCR 48.
Thanks. I'll take that. Great. I'll take that.
Thank you.
I enjoyed what you
Thank you. Please, everyone, take your seats. Please take your seats so we can begin our second panel. We had a few folks that just had to take a break. As soon as they return to the room, we're going to begin. Don't forget you are being live streamed. Go ahead.
My daughter just sent it to me from California. She's there watching it. Yeah.
Mr. Davis just ran to the restroom.
Yeah, so one of the panelists said, "Oh, can I go too?"
Oh, gotcha.
Good luck. Good luck.
It's tough. Hey, Anastasia. How are you? Marsha, how you doing over there? Marcia, how are you? Hey, Judge, thank you for being here. Appreciate you. Okay, if we could just ask you to take your seats. We are just waiting for our panelists to come back in, but I don't want us to get too too far removed. So we're going to do this next panel, and some of our members may have to leave us before this panel is over, but we should be finished not later than 12:15. So if you could just bear with us, we'd appreciate it. See, but this one we don't do the opening statements. We're just going to go straight to the panel, so we'll be fine. Naila, is it pronounced? Naila. Got it. We're going to begin, and we'll just let Mr. Brickner join us when he returns. Okay, we are prepared to begin, so we would start today with, let me introduce the witnesses. Tell me again, Naila Naylor. Naila Anwan is the senior counsel at Demos. Naila is a civil and human rights lawyer who joined Demos in 2015. She serves as local counsel in the A. Philip Randolph Institute versus LaRose case, challenging Ohio's practice of and procedures for purging infrequent voters from the registration rolls, and Mays versus LaRose, a case challenging Ohio's practice of denying eligible voters detained in the days preceding an election from accessing absentee ballots in jails. Ina Jo Davis Chappelle, member of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections since she was appointed in April of 2007. She is a partner at Ulmer Byrne in Cleveland, where she chairs the firm's nonprofit group. Mike Brickner, Ohio State Director, All Voting is Local, a new campaign that seeks to work proactively to expand access to the ballot. Prior to joining AVL, Mike worked at the ACLU of Ohio for 14 years, most recently serving as its Senior Policy Director. Ms. Anwan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, and to all the committee members for the invitation to testify today. My name is Naila Awan, and I'm a senior counsel at Demos, the think and do tank that powers the movement for a just, inclusive, multiracial democracy. My testimony will focus on 2 voter suppression issues that Demos has been actively combating in Ohio. I will discuss Ohio's controversial practice of targeting voters for removal from the registration rolls simply because they could not or chose not to vote, as well as Ohio's restriction on absentee voting in jails. An Ohio purge procedure known as the supplemental process treats the right to vote as a use it or lose it right. Under this process, Ohio uses an individual's failure to vote over a 2-year period as an indicator that they have moved. It sends such registrants a confirmation card and then removes them from the voter rolls if they do not respond to the card or vote in the subsequent 4-year period. Representing the Ohio A. Philip Randolph Institute, the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, and Larry Harmon, a longtime Ohio resident and military veteran who was purged under the supplemental process, Demos and the ACLU of Ohio brought a lawsuit in 2016 challenging Ohio's supplemental process on 2 grounds. First, that the use of non-voting to initiate a purge practice violated the National Voter Registration Act. And second, that the confirmation card Ohio sent to voters targeted for removal under the process did not satisfy the informational requirements set forth in the NVRA. Last year in Houston versus A. Philip Randolph Institute, the U.S. Supreme Court considered the first of these two claims and determined that Ohio was not violating the NVRA by targeting voters for removal based only on their failure to vote. However, that does not make the supplemental process wise or right. A brief filed by 36 current and former Ohio election officials recognized that the supplemental process ultimately results in the disenfranchisement of thousands of Ohioans, undermines the ability to maintain up-to-date and accurate voter rolls, and other more targeted roll maintenance practices could be adopted without disenfranchising duly registered Ohioans. Further, the Supreme Court's decision did not consider the constitutionality of Ohio's purge practice or whether it unlawfully discriminates on the basis of race. In her dissent, Justice Sotomayor did recognize that barriers to the ballot box that are experienced by communities whose voices have been traditionally marginalized through the political process render them particularly vulnerable to unwarranted removal under the supplemental process. Time and again, Ohioans across the state show up to vote only to be told at the polls that their names are no longer on the voter registration rolls. We were able to secure court-ordered relief, commonly referred to as the APRI exception, on our first claim for the November 2016 general election. This relief allowed over 7,500 eligible voters in Ohio to participate in 2016 who would have otherwise been disenfranchised. And the exception has remained in place for each Ohio election since that time. Even after last year's Supreme Court decision, the Sixth Circuit determined that the APRI exception should remain in place in November 2018 to provide relief for purged voters who likely received insufficient notice. We are concerned that Ohio continues to use the supplemental process and that the availability of relief to prevent the disenfranchisement of voters who were unlawfully and illegitimately purged remains in question. A different voting problem that Demos is currently engaged in within Ohio is that registered voters who are arrested and held in jails after the absentee ballot request deadline and detained through Election Day are prevented from obtaining and casting an absentee ballot despite remaining completely eligible under Ohio law. On November 6, 2018, Demos Campaign Legal Center and MacArthur Justice Center filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 2 voters who were detained on misdemeanor charges after the time when they could request absentee ballots, and approximately 1,000 other similarly situated voters who were impacted each election. Challenging as unconstitutional the state's practice of locking these late jailed voters out of the political process. A federal judge in the Southern District of Ohio issued a temporary restraining order requiring that Ohio deliver ballots to our named clients and count their votes, finding that our clients would likely succeed on their claim, had the right to vote, and no mechanism by which to do so. This and other barriers to voting, such as the topic some of my fellow panelists are addressing, make it more difficult for Ohioans, particularly those traditionally marginalized in our democracy, to cast a ballot. We at Demos look forward to working with this committee to increase access to the ballot and better protect the right to vote.
Thank you. Ms. Davis-Chappelle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Honorable Marshall Fudge, Chairperson of the Subcommittee on Elections, for this opportunity today and the invitation to be here. Thanks also to the election subcommittee members, Butterfield and Davis, and all of the distinguished members of the United House of Representatives who are present. I'm currently a member of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, where I've had the privilege of serving as a board member since 2007 and as immediate past board chair for the last 6 years. I'm also a former member and chair of the Ohio Board of Voting Machine Examiners. Please know that my testimony and comments today reflect my personal opinion and viewpoint, and I'm not here in any representative or official capacity as a member of the Board of Elections. I am a non-governmental witness, but my thoughts, conclusions, and statements here today are informed by my experiences in election administration as a member of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections and as an active voter in Ohio. Notwithstanding my disclaimer that I don't represent anybody here that's also on the board with me, I am very much an advocate of voting rights, full enfranchisement of all voters, especially in my home county of Cuyahoga County, and for robust ballot access, which includes unfettered opportunities for early voting in person and vote by mail. For those of you that do not know, Cuyahoga County is the largest voting district in Ohio. It has the greatest number of registered voters. And the most recent Cuyahoga County election statistics from November 2018 are an indicator of size as follows. 903,046 registered voters, 973 precincts, 345 voting locations, 59 municipalities. We have 91 employees, and we use a significant number of temporary staff in any given election. For instance, in the November 2016 election, we hired 321 temporary staff, resulting in a payroll of nearly $1 million. Although a smaller election in November, significant temporary staff were hired with payroll process totaling more than $500,000. I'm going to skip some of those details because I want to focus on today what I believe to be challenges in election administration and the importance of early voting. One of the ongoing challenges faced by our Cuyahoga County Board of Elections concerns the ability to set our own rules around early voting. In Ohio, at least since 2014, a decision was made by the Secretary of State, the Ohio Legislature, and our trade association that uniformity in the rules governing elections administration would be the key organizing principle for the 88 county boards of elections. Although these county boards in Ohio are very different in size, number of voters, staffing, and available resources, uniform rules have continued to be adopted and continue to be implemented in a manner that limits rather than expands ballot access. While reasonable minds fairly disagree about the extent to which uniform rules have hindered voter participation in Cuyahoga County, I personally believe that limited early voting hours, particularly in large-scale election cycles, runs counter to basic democratic principles and has excluded urban, poor, and older voters from the process. Some argue that this issue has now been well settled, a negotiated result has been codified, but I view the uniformity principle and practice of having the same in-person early voting hours for every county as a missed opportunity, both for efficient election administration and robust voter participation in the largest voting district in Ohio. Early voting remains a key tool for efficient election administration. The opportunity to cast ballots other than on election day is important for voters and for those of us charged with counting those ballots cast. Since 2010, early voting numbers represent anywhere from 35 to 40% of the total votes cast in elections in our county. Early voting has had a positive impact and effect on election administration, and wait times allows for preliminary processing and results in efficient use of our staff time. Because of the importance of early voting, it should be noted that a significant challenge to election administration exists. That challenge is the state limitation codified at Ohio Revised Code section 350110C, which prescribes early voting only at one location operated by a board of elections where voting is permitted. I'm going to have to skip over the statute because I'm running out of time, but there are pictures that I have asked be shown to you to show the effect of early in-person voting and the restriction to one location.
Can you stop? Can you see these screens?
This is our early voting location in Cuyahoga County at East 30th and Euclid Avenue. At this one location, we have significant space constraints, parking is limited, and the site is congested, difficult to manage during heavy periods of voting. So we have pictures from 2008 early voting, 2016 election day with lines wrapped around blocks around our building. We have 2018 in-house early voting pictures both inside and outside of our building. Because of the limit in Ohio and the statutory provision, it's a proviso of the code section I mentioned, voting lines are long, especially during the presidential election cycle. So there's clearly a substantial challenge in our county with this one site limitation for early voting. It's my hope that legislative initiatives from our state for vote centers will be established and will move forward. Such centers, of course, would need to be identified and located in a manner that is equitable, fair, and strategically sited to serve both suburban and urban voters. In 2018, in the 132nd General Assembly, Representative Dan Ramos introduced House Bill 596 that would have allowed counties to add additional early voting sites, an additional site for every 60,000 registered voters. The bill was referred to committee and appears to have died there. Sadly, no new legislation on this matter has been introduced. Additional opportunities for early voting sites would clearly enhance election administration capabilities. As a general comment, I wanted to share my observation over the years that major impediments to efficient elections administration in our county include last-minute changes to process and voting rules, constant litigation, even on expedited track, and the politicization of voting rights in the elections process. So when I look at turnout, we talked about turnout. We can provide you with data that over the years, you just can't look at one election. We've got some suggestions for you about things you can do. They're in my written testimony, but the constant clamoring about rampant voter fraud is discouraging voter participation, and my experience over the years permits me to say with confidence that claims of voter fraud in the elections process are wholly without merit.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brickner. And we'd like to try to get the photograph so that... Mr. Brickner.
Thank you to Chairwoman Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the Subcommittee on Elections. My name is Mike Brickner, Ohio State Director for All Voting is Local, and I submit testimony on the current state of voting rights and election administration in Ohio. All Voting is Local launched in 2018 as a collaborative campaign housed at the Leadership Conference Education Fund in conjunction with the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation, the American Constitution Society, the Campaign Legal Center, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We fight to protect and expand the right to vote, working directly with disenfranchised communities to fight for a democracy that works for us all. Ohioans, particularly people of color, face needless barriers to the ballot, including polling places that are moved, leaving voters confused and frustrated, and high rejection rates of provisional ballots, leaving voters at risk of losing their sacred right to vote. As a state and as a nation, we must fight to eliminate these obstacles to voting. Ohio must do its part to ensure elections are administered freely and fairly so that all voices are heard. Ohio voters increasingly cast their ballots before Election Day. Despite its success, Ohio politicians have proposed restrictions to early in-person voting. NAACP v. Houston challenged the elimination of evening and weekend early in-person voting hours and the elimination of same-day voter registration during a portion of early voting, stating the cuts would discriminate against black voters. And in fact, that was a claim brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. While the Ohio Secretary of State agreed to some evening and weekend hours, the settlement agreement is no longer in force and there's no law guaranteeing these hours. In January 2019, All Voting is Local analyzed early in-person voting from the 2016 and 2018 general elections in 6 representative Ohio counties. We found that early in-person voting was popular in all areas, urban, rural, and suburban. The most popular times to cast a ballot included weekend hours and the week before Election Day. In recent elections, voters waited in long lines at early voting locations, not just in Cuyahoga County, but at many places across the state. Given the success of early in-person voting hours should be formalized in state law and should be expanded on the week prior to the election and on weekends. Polling place changes cause confusion and frustration for voters, which nonpartisan poll monitors noted in Cuyahoga County in 2018. Between 2016 and 2018, the county eliminated 41 polling locations, and nearly 16% of all precincts changed location. While polling places were reduced countywide, majority black communities were particularly harmed. In Cleveland's 17 wards, 8 are majority black, comprising from 98 to 72% of the population. Of the city's 45 precincts with polling place changes, the majority, 29, were in black majority wards, while only 16 were in black minority wards. For voters who rely on public transportation, have inflexible work schedules, or have a disability, the burden of traveling to a new polling location cannot be overstated. At one polling location in a black majority Cleveland ward, officials told a voter she was at the wrong location. She told the poll monitor she was simply going to go home and would not vote. The poll monitor encouraged her to call the Board of Elections and go to her correct polling location, but the voter left frustrated and discouraged. We don't know if she voted. At another poll location in a black majority ward here in Cleveland, poll monitors reported assisting 40 voters who were at the wrong location. Both of these poll locations in these examples had changes between 2016 and 2018. State law requires that election officials notify voters with a postcard if their polling location is changed. Elections officials must do more to ensure these changes do not have a disparate impact on voters of color. Elections officials should clearly post signage outside any poll location with changes. In addition, officials should partner with community groups to solicit if changes are made so that voters are informed. Lastly, provisional ballots are often a last resort for voters who have problems at the polls. While provisional ballots can be beneficial for voters who might otherwise be turned away, their use should be minimized. Ohio has one of the highest overall number of provisional ballots cast nationwide. In 2018 in Franklin County, the rate of provisional ballots cast countywide was only 1.84%. However, we did some analysis and we have some maps that show this. Our analysis found that people of color, millennials, and low-income voters were significantly more likely to cast a provisional ballot. If the maps come on, you'll see that there are areas of Franklin County. The blue are black voters, the pink are millennial voters, and the green are low-income voters. The orange dots are where provisional ballots were cast in the county. There are certainly people living in those areas without shading, but there were hardly any provisional ballots cast in those areas. Those are mostly white, affluent areas where there are older folks who live there as well. So in our analysis, we found, again, people of color, millennials, and low-income voters were more likely to cast a provisional ballot. If you look at just 3 polling locations near Ohio State University's campus, nearly
the question about Section 2 litigation. Counsel, do you know if there's been any Section 2 litigation in Ohio?
Yes, and I think Mr. Brickner spoke to this as well.
Yes.
The challenges to the state's elimination of the early vote or same-day registration period and cuts to early voting brought in 2014, and there was some litigation brought later on some of those
Under
same
the Voting
issues.
Rights Act?
Were brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act,
Yes.
as well as the Equal Protection Clause. So there were challenges related to the disparate impact that those cuts had on people based on the basis of race, as well as the impacts that it would have on individuals.
So
with
just
lower
one lawsuit
incomes.
that you
Yes.
can recall?
Well, there were at least 2 lawsuits addressing the cuts to early voting, and then
What about at the local level?
that I'm not entirely sure of.
Are you aware of the cost associated with Section 2 litigation? I
I
know
mean-
in my state of North Carolina, it's very expensive. I did VRA litigation back in the 80s, and even back then it was several $100,000, and I suspect now it probably has exceeded $1 million.
I mean, so I cannot speak to the actual numbers. I would say that I would assume that the cost would be quite high based on
But you
other-
stipulate it's very expensive.
Yeah, and I would actually say too that based on other voting rights litigation that I've been involved in that doesn't require expert reports to the extent that Section 2 litigation does,
Yes.
you can just going through the preliminary injunction process and some of the depositions be ranging into the millions, right?
Thank you. Ms. Chappelle, do changing the laws constantly affect the ability of the Board of Elections to effectively administer the elections?
Absolutely. In Cuyahoga County, our Board of Election is the subject of or involved in a number of suits, and it impacts, even when the suit is filed on an expedited track, it impacts our ability to prepare for the election, it impacts staff time, and it's just the uncertainty about knowing, are we putting something on the ballot? Are we taking something on the ballot? Do we have to have the messaging needed at the polling location to make sure people are aware of what the change is? So the litigation absolutely impacts us in an adverse way.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I yield back.
Mr. Joyce?
Ms. Chappelle, what would you recommend as a cure for that problem? I understand that a lot of times when there's there's lawsuits about the ballots, you're already stuck at the administration of purchasing ballots and then potential to repurchase ballots because if something goes on or goes off. Do you have a recommendation that should be a time set certain for all litigation to be filed by to allow boards to have more time to do that?
I thank you for the question, and I do think one of the ways in which we can try to reduce some of the litigation is to do exactly what this committee is doing and come to some real understanding about what's happening, what's triggering the litigation. Looking at elections, not in just a vacuum, one election at one time to reach a conclusion about what it's saying, but over time looking at what the patterns are. And coming to some basic fundamental conclusions which resonate, I think, for most voters, that voting is so critical and intrinsic to our democracy that you don't forfeit your right to vote. You don't lose your right to vote. And there ought to be a way to balance the need to maintain voting records with the need to ensure that there are opportunities for full access to the ballot. So, I mean, if we hit some of these issues, I think the litigation will be, the cost and litigation itself will be driven down.
Thank you. Another one that's not necessarily right on point with what we're discussing today, but since you have the expertise here in Ohio regarding it, I understand the Secretary of State is working with the counties to purchase or procure new voting machines for everyone. I understand from my time at working as a prosecutor that the system we had in Geauga County, for example, was ESS, Election Software and Systems, I believe. And to allow fixes the day of elections, they had a back door that was set up so that people could come into the computer, come into the scanner and do some changes. What do you see, and what needs to be done to make sure that no one has the ability to hack those voting machines?
Well, that's a great question. We also have ES&S as our vendor here in Cuyahoga County. I think one thing at the federal level you can do is really put some teeth into the EAC. Really look to make sure that the testing labs that are used, because there aren't that many, that there are enough that they are testing the equipment to make sure that there's no way to hack in. Most of our equipment is not connected to the internet. There's been extensive cybersecurity, intrusive testing, and we have been on the forefront of making sure, at least making the effort to ensure that we are not hacked. But there's a lot around cybersecurity that needs to be done, and so yes, there has been money allocated to allow us to continue that effort.
And you're going to be part of that study to make sure it doesn't happen for us?
Be happy to be a part of it, absolutely.
I yield back.
Ms. Capter? It's on automatically. It's on, Marcy. It's on. Just start talking. Okay. You turned it off, I think.
There. All right, thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question about provisional ballots. And first of all, thank you all for what you're doing. What you're doing is so important to the country and to this state. You went over the data very quickly, Mr. Brickner, but what would you say to the people gathered today about what Ohio could do to fix the problems with provisional ballots? Why do we have so many? Why are so many rejected? Many on the basis of signature? Why is that? What's going on in this state with provisional ballots? And I can tell you from the counties that I represent, and I represent parts of 5, due to very sinister gerrymandering. I could say plenty. But this is mathematical. And it isn't just Ohio. And it's the reason that we have such trouble in Congress, because the system defaults to extremes. And both parties have their share of those members now who cannot reach compromise. And it is mathematical. So I want to ask you, in terms of provisional ballots, talk about the big picture of provisional ballots in this state. I've seen so many voters misdirected at the precinct level. We need greater training of our booth workers, and it has to happen at the local level, at the most local of levels, by wards. But I want to ask you, on the provisional ballot issue, get us inside that system. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in this state.
Absolutely. So if you look at provisional ballots, again, Ohio is an outlier with other states. We cast far too many provisional ballots, and far too many people of color particularly cast provisional ballots. With rejections and why people cast provisional ballots, the number one reason why a person has to cast a provisional ballot in the state is because they are not in the poll book. And that has to do, I think, with our outdated voter registration system. If you look at the fact that we don't have automatic ways to update your voter registration or same-day voter registration that would allow somebody who recently moved into the state or is a student to be able to go on election day or during the early voting period to register to vote, that becomes a major barrier. Most people don't think about voting 35 days before the election or in excess of that. And so, we tend to leave things up to the last minute. Having an automatic system and same-day voter registration would help that. I think to your other points...
Is Ohio, I'm going to interrupt you, sir. I'm going to ask Ms. Chappelle also to comment. Is Ohio effectively applying for and using the election assistance dollars at the federal level to help solve some of these issues?
Well, let me just say thank you for the question. The implementation of electronic poll books is going to be helpful. We believe in reducing the number of provisional ballots cast. Because the e-poll books are able to, when the ID is swiped, to tell the voter you are in the wrong location, and not only you are in the wrong location, this is the place you need to be, so it will direct the voter to the correct location. The provisional ballots, unfortunately, are a necessary evil, because I'd rather have somebody vote provisionally than not vote at all. We do have a robust way of reconciling those votes. We've seen the numbers come down. We're always looking at ways to try to figure out what's happening with the numbers. And there is a disparate impact, but we have got to continue to have it because we need people to vote.
There was one other question this afternoon or this morning regarding hacking into our election systems. And I just want to say that in reading the Mueller report, I can assure the American people the hacking into our election systems was significant and continues. And here in Ohio, for those responsible, it's very important for us to think about how we gird ourselves against what this election year and the next is going to yield, and how we really armor ourselves against hacking. And I heard what you said about not being connected to the internet, but we need really good oversight. Do you think our state has the capability to do that well, and our counties?
I think we're starting to, under our Secretary of State LaRose, there's been dollars allocated for cybersecurity measures for each county in Ohio was required to undergo, to take advantage actually of a cyber security consultant to begin some of that process. I think there's a lot more work to be done there though, but steps have been taken.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Thank you, witnesses, for being here and for your participation. Ms. Chappell, I want to read something from your written testimony that I don't think you were able to get to and just kind of co-sign on that. I'm just going to quote you here. It says, I was pleased that just a few months ago, our new Ohio Secretary of State and Chief Elections Officer Frank LaRose stated that voter fraud was rare. We need more truthful public statements like this. Amen to that. Completely agree. Thank you for stating that. I'll give another kind of cosign, Mr. Raskin earlier, and we've talked a lot about the partisan gerrymandering that takes place. I'm thrilled that we passed in Ohio the law that we did on our last election cycle to hopefully stop that. I think our democracy functions far better when the districts make more sense, candidly. Let me get to some questions. And also, obviously, Ms. Chappell, I want to thank you for all the service on the BOE. My wife voted in Ohio for the first few times. She's new to Ohio, and the process was seamless, and I know that that was in large part due to your leadership and Pat McDonald's leadership and everybody at the board. So I really appreciate all the work that you did.
Thank you for that.
My question, and I only really have one, is, so one of the main reasons our bipartisan county boards of election eliminate precincts and polling locations is in part due to the fact that it's become harder to find people willing to work as precinct election officials on election day. This is partly due to the fact that pay for this vital service is very low, and because county boards of election are unable to raise the pay threshold due to various administrative challenges. For example, if a PEO makes more than $600 in a year, even if they're working 3 or 4 elections, the Board of Election would have to begin issuing 1099s or W-2s for these workers. There's also the issue of OPERS, retirees being unable to work part-time at the board or as booth workers because of a U.S. Treasury rule resulting from the ACA. So I guess my question would be, first, do you support studying ways to remove barriers at the federal level to make hiring part-time election workers easier, and then what would those be? Help us understand that.
Yeah, no, I do appreciate the question. We hire a huge group of individuals to work the polls. I mean, the number is staggering. We have to do it. One of the suggestions, I actually in my written testimony get a few suggestions for you guys. One would be to let's move the marathon day of voting to the weekends. Would help us recruit poll workers. People would get release time. We would have 2 days to administer the election instead of one crazy long day. And I think we would be able to improve the numbers and the quality of the poll workers that we get for that kind of weekend voting. Again, vote centers would allow us, I think, to do that and have a major effect on poll workers.
Great. Anything else on just kind of the availability piece of finding poll workers? I think that's a reasonable suggestion we should look at, but anything else?
We've had a pretty robust program over the years of, engaging our poll workers, training our poll workers. We have a program that allows for repeat folks to work with us so we don't lose their expertise. I think there have to be one of my recommendations. If we should have election day be a national holiday, and people should be off from work and really allowed an opportunity to exercise the franchise. We would see greater numbers of poll workers if we do something like that.
Thank you. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also want to thank this panelist for providing a lot of the statistics and facts about why it is that it's so important that we, maybe that's the question I should ask, is it important that we restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965? I think that I started my questioning in the last panel about myths. And one of the myths that I think that people often espouse is that voter roll maintenance, which is very important, don't get me wrong, I think that that's important. But is it more important that we purge people than we encourage people to go and vote? I mean, to say that we're voter maintenance is about cost, we're trying to lower the cost of administering elections. At the end of the day, though, isn't our job also to promote democracy? And isn't democracy about promoting access to the ballot box and making sure that we're encouraging? Has the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlived its time? That's really, I guess, the question I'd ask you, Mr. Brechner.
Absolutely not. We are, in full support of the VRAA and having a new formula for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And I think your point around data collection and really understanding the problems is a really important one to remember when we're thinking about the Voting Rights Act, because certainly under the formulas that are being proposed, they're very flexible. And it's important for us to collect data to show what is really happening in a jurisdiction to see if pre-clearance is needed in that jurisdiction.
And would you say, given the fact that you've given us a lot of data, both in your written testimony but also in your oral, do you think that the data shows that we need to figure out a formula to put back the full protections of the Voting Rights Act?
Absolutely, and that we need a system to also keep the data for the entire country and for longer periods of time. We as a nonprofit organization put this together. I think that the government has a role in keeping that data.
Let's go along in that same line of questioning. So, Ms. Chabelle, first of all, thank you so much for your years of service to the Board of Registrars. You do an admirable job that is critically important in protecting our democracy. Does the federal government have a role to play? So often I hear that the federal government's setting up barriers, but I think that many of us, especially those of us who come from states like Alabama that were part of the former Confederacy, that literally I wouldn't be a member of Congress, let alone Alabama's first black congresswoman, had we not gotten the right to vote and civil rights. And last time I checked, it was the federal government and the federal court systems that actually gave us that right. We are co-equal branches of government, just like the judiciary, and we have a role to play in making sure that we promote this democracy. So I guess my question to you is, when you think about the many barriers and impediments to what you're doing in your role, is the federal government the biggest impediment?
No, thank God for the Supremacy Clause, and thank God for federal preemption. I really think you guys have got to really give some, and what you're doing today is important to oversee what's happening at the state level. We have to get, numbers can be made to say anything, and we can parse out, and numbers are important, and the data
They're
collection
critically important.
The data collection is important, but it's got to be overlaid with some basic fundamental principles that the vote cannot be forfeit. You cannot forfeit your vote. How can you forfeit your vote? So I think we have to have the federal government absolutely involved. In my testimony, written testimony, I actually gave you a specific thing you might consider, authorizing a subsidy perhaps to the U.S. Post Office that would cover the cost of processing and delivery of absentee ballots.
I like that.
And, you know, I mean, we've got a lot of ideas here at our Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, but we do think the role of the federal government and your role is key to allowing full and unfettered access to the ballot.
So in closing, I just want to say I had the great opportunity of being the member of Congress representing Alabama during the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. And I had as my special guest Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson at the State of the Union in 2015. She was the oldest living, at the time, survivor of being bludgeoned on that bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. She was at the time 103 years old. And I had the opportunity to meet with her, for her to meet President Barack Obama in this small little room off to the Capitol before he gave his speech. And to a person, everyone came in and kneeled down where she was sitting in her wheelchair and said, Miss Boynton, you know, we are where we are, Miss Amelia, because of you and your sacrifices. We stand on your shoulders, is what they kept saying. So by the time President Obama came in, all of his cabinet members had all said the same thing. We stand on your shoulders. We stand on your shoulders. When Eric Holder said it, she said, get off my shoulders, all of y'all. Do your own work, is what she said. There is plenty of work to be done, and we must do our own work. And I just want to remind this panel of our constitutional responsibility. We have to do our own work. Progress is elusive. Progress never, ever, ever stays the same. We have to fight to hold on to the progress that we've made in this country and advance it for future generations. And I just want to make sure, I know that this panel has a very important work that has to be done, and I look forward to seeing us continue to do that and do our constitutional duty. Thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Davis for his closing comments as well as questions if you have some.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses. I appreciate your attendance here. Quick question. Any of you can answer it, or all of you. Now, since the Supreme Court's 2013 decision on Shelby County, have you noticed any enforcement trends related to Sections 2 and 3?
I can't cite numbers, but what I would say is we've seen an increase in the number of Section 2 Voting Rights Act lawsuits prior to, you know, the states, especially where there was previously pre-clearance in place.
So there are an increase in lawsuits, but you're not seeing any enforcement actions.
Well, and I mean, some of these Section 2 lawsuits have been successful, requiring there to be changes in the law, right, as a result of that. I mean, prior to Shelby County, there were very few vote denial cases brought, right? Everything was under the vote dilution section of Section 2 of the VRA almost, where it was addressing gerrymandering. But now we're seeing things brought about voter ID, elimination of same-day registration and early voting opportunities, elimination of pre-registration. So, you know, I think that we've seen an uptick in the need for that.
Anybody else?
I don't have any data to be able to be responsive.
Okay. Mr. Brigg?
I would agree with Ms. Allen.
Okay. So, number one, thanks again for being here. This has been a great opportunity to hear from our colleagues. This is a great opportunity to understand what happens in a state that's not our own. You know, as somebody who's from Illinois, somebody who has coincidentally 4 public universities in his district, I obviously don't know how that happened with the Democrat supermajorities and the Democratic governor in 2011, but that's clearly a gerrymandered district. The gerrymandering issues that are talked about here at this dais happen, as Ms. Capter said, in a bipartisan manner. And I certainly hope that I can count on the support of my colleagues as we move into this next set of redistricting to do what we can to stop a practice that shouldn't happen anywhere, let alone in Illinois or Ohio. But I want to say thank you to both panels, because the message I got out of this hearing today, too, is that there are a lot of folks that are happy with both what Secretary of State LaRose is doing in this state right now. You know, yet there's a process of voter maintenance that he and predecessors have had to do to follow the law, to follow decisions made by our federal government and our federal courts. And the process right now from my data lasts 4 years. So thank you for recognizing the efforts of Secretary LaRose, because I think that clearly shows this hearing has a very bipartisan result. And that's exactly what I mentioned in my opening comments. Now, I do want to say I'm a little confused by Ms. Chappelle and Mr. Brickner. You had some issues about, you talked about how the state of Ohio has early voting everywhere, county offices, same time, same days. That's strictly, it's exactly the same everywhere at the same time, right?
Throughout the state.
Throughout the state.
That's correct.
As I was in North Dakota a week and a half ago, many of the witnesses said that since there wasn't such strict adherence to times and dates, that was the reason why voters were somehow being suppressed from voting. Which is it?
I can answer that. So I think that with uniformity and equal protection, which was why there were uniform hours put in place years ago by former Secretary Husted, I think that with what Ms. Chappelle said, it was more of a race to the bottom was how equal protection worked. It wasn't about lifting up all of the counties. We instead took away some of the evening and weekend hours. And I think that uniformity actually has some benefits. If we're talking about public education for voters, it can become confusing if there are more hours in one county and fewer hours in an adjoining county just to put that out on television or
I
newspaper
appreciate
or
that,
other
and
things.
I wanted to make sure that we got it clarified as we.
But I think we
different.
need to raise the bar, too, when we talk about expanding evening and weekend hours.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that clarification. And there's one comment that my colleague made earlier. Numbers are important. We had a lot of discussion about population. The population of Ohio is growing less than 1% right now. And we saw an increase in voter turnout of 15%. It seems like folks here in Ohio, you're doing something right. And I want to commend you, and I want to commend everybody here for working hard to ensure that that happens, and encourage you and encourage everyone to continue to work with our election officials to make sure that trend continues to go up. Work hard to make sure there's an accurate count with the Senate. Work hard to make sure people get a chance to cast their vote, because that is the backbone of a free society. And I'm glad to be a part of this subcommittee. I'm glad to be here in Ms. Fudge, Ms. Capter, Mr. Joyce's, and Mr. Gonzalez's almost hometowns in some cases. But this is an opportunity for us to learn. And let me tell you something, I've learned. And I appreciate your testimony, appreciate the time, and I appreciate Chair Fudge's leadership.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses and just say a couple of things. One is, I clearly understand that we follow the law, but every law is not just. Martin Luther King told us that years and years ago, that every law is not just because it was against the law for us to vote. It was not a just law, but it was the law. So I think that sometimes we have to look at what is right and what is fair and what is just. And just because it is the law does not make it right. So we changed the country not through the law, really through the Supreme Court. It was the Supreme Court that determined we should be able to vote. The same thing when black people could not serve in certain parts of the military. It was not the legislature, it was not the law, it was the courts. And so sometimes we have to look at them and say, it may be what is written, it doesn't mean that it is right. And so, you know, there was a time we had to sit at the back of the bus. It wasn't right, but it was the law. So sometimes we can't follow the law because it is not just. Certainly uniformity is not equity. It's a lot harder for 1 million people to vote at one polling place between the hours of 9 and 5 than it is for 5,000. And so it is not just. It may be what is on paper, but it is not just. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today for their testimony. We may have some additional questions, and we would ask that you would respond to us in writing, and we will put it in the record. I want to thank Tri-C for always being so kind and having their doors open to us whenever we need them, especially Claire Wasako and all of those who made this happen. I want to thank my colleagues for being here, and I think that it's important for you all to see us together as opposed to seeing what the television says. We disagree on many, many things. There are very few things I agree with Rodney on. But I like Rodney. Rodney is my friend. And so we have relationships. So don't ever believe that we are enemies. We are not. And I am just so pleased that Rodney has taken the time to come here because a lot of people thought he wouldn't. And so I thank you for that from the very bottom of my heart. We disagree on how to get there, but we all love our country. And so I know that we are here to try to fix something that was changed. We're here to fix the Voting Rights Act, and I believe that we're going to do it. I have confidence in my colleagues that they are willing to work with me. I know these are. And so we're going to move this process forward. I want to thank our staffs. Like I said, you see a lot of things here, but all I really do is come and sit down. Our staffs do this work, and I want to thank them for the work they do. And with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.